I majored in archaeology. And at some point you have to choose a specific field of archaeology, you know, prehistorical archaeology, Greek and Roman archaeology, but I chose the ancient Near East, or the modern Middle East, because I thought that would be much more mysterious. And so I took classes in ancient Mesopotamia, Assyria, all of that. And at one point, there was a professor that I had, the late Ernie Haring, who said, you know, everybody who does Assyriology always learns cuneiform, you know, the writing, but nobody ever does Hebrew and Aramaic, at least from his perspective. Like, we have so many ancient documents and texts written in Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus spoke, but not many scholars in the world who know these languages. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. I'll take note of that. So when I graduated with my master's, I was 22 and I didn't feel really ready to go on the job market. So I was like, I want to continue my education and learn something else. And I now have the archaeology part, but I also want to have the textual part, the linguistics behind it. And so I moved to the University of Leiden in the Netherlands. I moved to Holland. And I started a second bachelor degree in Hebrew and Aramaic languages and cultures, because you can't study that anywhere else but there. And so in those years, I had biblical Hebrew, ancient Hebrew classes, Aramaic, Syriac, which is a dialect of Aramaic, Phoenician. And then we started reading Dead Sea Scrolls. And so this whole new world opened up to me. And I was like, this is so fascinating. I wasn't raised particularly religious, but I was very fascinated by religion my entire life. I was always the one going to like little churches when we would go on holidays. And so I got really enthralled by this whole history of ancient Judaism, early Christianity in the Middle East. And at that time I started becoming a part of an excavation project in Israel, where we excavated an ancient synagogue from the late Roman Byzantine period. And I'm still involved in that project. I'm field director now there. But so that brought me to Israel. And so every single year I go back to Israel. Like last fall, I stayed in Jerusalem for 3 months at the Albright Institute to do research for my dissertation. And I got to know a lot of scholars who work in Israel, archaeologists over that time. So that's really become my passion. And another thing, when I graduated with my second degree, I worked for a little while at the National Museum of Antiquities in Leiden, which is the biggest archaeology museum in the Netherlands. And I worked as the assistant curator for the curator of the Ancient Near Eastern department. And at some point, a camera crew or a production team went to my curator that I was looking for and asked him if he would be interested in joining them to go to Turkey, to Mount Ararat, to look for the lost Ark of Noah. The curators say, well, I don't have time to take off an entire month or whatever to go with you to Turkey for this documentary or whatever you want to make. But I know somebody who does. And so I took it upon myself and I joined the production team and I went to Turkey for a month and we climbed Mount Ararat. And we were in the snow in our tents, and we did go into an ice cave and saw the planks that were being stashed there. Of course, we were not allowed to take any tests or to take any planks with us. And so I still believe the whole thing was a hoax. And I had also watched some Chinese excavators on YouTube for a couple of years. I mean, I think that was in 2012. A couple of years earlier, going to the same place with the same Kurdish guides. But it was just such a fascinating trip. And I never forgot about it, of course. And so anything that has to do with biblical archaeology or the mysteries or the hoaxes or the conspiracy theories have always fascinated me. Of course, I consider myself a serious archaeologist. But still, it's so fascinating. So when I heard that this book would come out in 2016, I immediately went out and got it and I read it. And so I've known Chanan Tigay through that, and not personally, but through reading the book. And so when we had a chance to invite him for Sasa, of course, I was very enthusiastic to have him here. And so I read the book a second time, and now I have a million questions for him, which I'm sure you guys will have too. So Without further ado, and enough about me, let me introduce our guest formally to you. And I wrote a little introduction to introduce you to him. So Chanan Tigay is now an associate professor at San Francisco State University in the Department of Creative Writing. But more importantly, he's also an investigative journalist who has written articles for the New Yorker, the Wall Street Journal, the Jerusalem Post, and many, many other newspapers and magazines. He was born in Jerusalem and received university degrees from Columbia University and the University of Pennsylvania. And his works have won many awards, including the Anne and Robert Cohen Writers' Prize. Among other topics, he has covered the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the attacks of 9/11, and church abuse scandals. And he has interviewed important figures, very important figures, like Hillary Clinton, John McCain, the Israeli Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and now I get to talk to him. And I believe he is currently at Harvard, where he is working on a new book on antiquities looting in the Middle East. Is that correct, Chanan? Is that where you are now?
I was at Harvard last year.
Oh, last year. Okay.
Yeah.
So the book is coming along. Chanan, that is one impressive resume. So thank you very much for being here and willing to talk to us. So we're going to talk about your book that came out a couple of years ago, which is one crazy ride of a story. I mean, it's investigative journalism, it's adventure, it's mystery, it's also scholarship, but it's basically an epic quest. And I was just telling Chanan before we went live that I told my friends, like, this is the Da Vinci Code, but better. It's better written, but it's real. And it's a much more intriguing story. When I read it, I just couldn't put the book down. So I think that's quite the accomplishment. So Chanan, again, welcome. And thank you for having me.
Thank you. I'm so happy you introduced yourself, because now I realize you were the one target reader I was probably writing this book for. So if you didn't like it, I would be in very, very big trouble. So thank you for the very kind introduction.
Do you want to introduce the book a little bit to people who might have not read it yet?
Yeah, for sure. So my elevator pitch about the book, the brief description, is that it's about the oldest Bible in the world, how its outing as a fraud led to a scandalous death, and why archaeologists now believe it's real if only they could find it. So what does that mean? You know, it began in the summer of 1883, when an antiquities dealer from Jerusalem by the name of Moses Wilhelm Shapira, who was born in the Pale of Settlement in Kamenets-Podolsk, which has historically been parts of Poland and Russia. He made his way to Jerusalem. On the way, he converted from Judaism to Christianity. Long story short, gets into antiquities dealing, shows up at the British Museum, as I say, in the summer of 1883, claims to have in his possession the oldest manuscript of the Bible in the world. It's a very, very weird and shortened copy of the Book of Deuteronomy, perhaps written by Moses himself. That's how the claim goes. And he was asking, at the time, an astonishing amount of money from the British Museum. He wanted £1 million sterling, which in today's money is something like, you know, $250 million. So it goes without saying that no one had ever spent that kind of money for a piece of the past. Frankly, they still haven't. And the world freaked out. You know, Britain was in the midst of a Bible craze at the time. And so he came at the exact right moment. The Prime Minister of England, William Ewart Gladstone himself, came to meet the famous guest Shapira to look at the manuscript, was so blown away, he started raising the money himself to make sure that England didn't lose out on this fantastic relic to Germany or France, kind of its colonial rivals. And Shapira became an overnight celebrity. His wife and daughter were back home in Jerusalem blowing exorbitant amounts of money on credit because they were about to become the richest people in all of Jerusalem. Meantime, the British Museum brought in Christian David Ginsburg, who was another Jewish man who'd converted to Christianity, but one of the great Bible scholars of the day. They brought him in to transcribe and translate, really to see what they had on their hands. And after about a month working away in the bowels of the British Museum while Shapira was outside being celebrated and wined and dined, Ginsburg came out and said, "Hold your horses. It's a fake. It's a fraud." And everyone was, of course, very upset by this. Shapira, most of all. And I'm not going to get into too many details because I don't want to give away necessarily too much, but suffice it to say that between the outing of this manuscript as a fraud and decades later, number one, many questions were raised as to whether or not the manuscript was in fact a fraud or whether that was a rush to judgment. Number two, the manuscript mysteriously vanished. Nobody knew what the heck had happened to it. It just sort of, fell off the face of the earth. And so when I learned about this story from my father, who is himself a scholar of the book of Deuteronomy, a book I had been hearing about since I was a very, very young boy, I immediately became obsessed with it and decided I had to find the missing manuscript and at least prove whether or not it was real or fake. And the book kind of alternates between the historical story of Moses Wilhelm Shapira and his period and my own hunt for this biblical manuscript across, I think it was about 8 countries on 4 continents over the course of close to 6 years.
Wow, that's impressive. So what made you think that you would be the one to do this? Because you don't have a background in ancient studies, right? So what made you think like, I'm gonna take this on, I'm gonna solve this mystery?
Yeah, it's a really good question that I don't have a really good answer for. I should say that, it took a little while, honestly. I heard about this story from my father at a Friday night dinner at my parents' house. And you were talking about, searching for Noah's Ark. This all, in a way, this whole story began because of that sort of thing. I'd just written a series of articles about a team of Chinese evangelicals who recently had announced that they'd discovered Noah's Ark. And as you all certainly know, someone seems to discover Noah's Ark, annually.
Right.
And of course, this one, within a few days, it became very clear that it was a hoax. What these people had done is they had disassembled an old-looking ship. They had hauled up wooden beams onto the top of Mount Ararat and left them there for a while. And then, months later, came back and said, "Oh my God, look what we found! It must be Noah's Ark." And so, in any case, I'd written a story not only about the supposed discovery and the subsequent debunking, but also because at that time, ASOR and a number of other organizations had banded together to form a committee to publicly fight against this kind of hoax, because they felt that because they were happening so frequently now, they were really undermining the work of archaeologists who were doing serious archaeology. They felt that serious archaeology didn't really get out into the public, but these hoaxes got out there. And so all people saw was hoaxes, and therefore they were going to begin to mistrust everything that archaeologists said. So I was writing about this, and we were sitting down for Friday night dinner, and I mentioned the articles to my father. And then he said, "Hey, you want to hear about a real biblical hoax?" And he began to tell me the story of Moses Wilhelm Shapira as much as he knew. And I was certainly hooked on it. I cannot say that night I said, I'm going to spend the next 6 years hunting down this manuscript. It took time. The more I dug, the more fascinated I became, the weirder the story became, the more I suspected that maybe it was actually real. And the more I realized that the only way I thought at the time to determine whether or not it was real or fake was to actually find it. And so I don't think there was ever, it was sort of like the frog slowly boiling in a pot. There was no single moment where I said, I'm the guy who should search this out because only I have the skills to find this. That never happened. And frankly, I don't think it's true. But gradually I became obsessed and drawn in. And at a certain point, what happens with obsession is that you just can't stop. And so that's what really happened with me.
Right. So because you traveled around the world, and then you start finding all these other people who have also been doing research on either the life of Shapiro or the document. And so you were clearly not the only one throughout this last century who's been enthralled by this story.
That's right. There's a subculture of people who call themselves Shapiro maniacs. And at the beginning of this, of course, I didn't know they existed, but I sort of very quickly became familiar with them. And in fact, there had been a number of scholars over the course of about 40 or 50 years who had done their best to track down the missing Shapira Deuteronomy and prove whether or not it was real or fake. Which, to be honest, that was actually rather daunting to me. Yeah. Because as I realized, Menachem Mansour, big names in the field had tried to do this. And I sort of was thinking, who am I, honestly, to think I can do this? That being said, I think sometimes in any field, whether it's ancient studies or something else, breakthroughs often happen when some outsider comes in who doesn't have the received wisdom that everyone within the field has, and you begin to kind of look in different ways, coming at it from different angles, and sometimes that helps out. I will say that along the way also, I ran into a guy making a documentary film about the Shapiro story, and he'd been at it, I think, for about 30 years at the time, and he was a serious guy. He'd made a number of real documentaries. He was an Israeli guy, and I was pretty intimidated by it. He'd been at it for 30 years, and I'd been at it for 6 months at the time when I think I met him, and so all of that was a bit daunting.
Any students who's like having to write a paper for their professor with a new insight into this old problem, and you're like, people have been doing this for 200 years. What can I possibly add to this?
Exactly. But as I said, I think along the way, a couple things happened. One is I became obsessed with it. Two is in the line of writing I do, which is known as sort of creative nonfiction or literary journalism, or there are any number of names. But the way it works on the business side of things is that you don't write the whole book and then sell it to a publisher. You write a book proposal, you sell the proposal to the publisher, they pay you in advance, and then you go off and write the book. And so in the interim, I had sold a book proposal to a publisher. So now they had paid me money. And so frankly, I couldn't stop because I'd have to pay them the money back. And I'd already spent it traveling around the world trying to find the manuscript.
Like a very expensive a journey. It's like, wow, now he's flying to Australia, and now he's flying to the British Museum. Wow, that must not have been cheap.
It was not cheap, but one thing I'll say, if we're trying to sort of encourage students to get into ancient studies or academia more generally, there are people out there, thank God, who believe that this kind of work is important and interesting. And so there are these pockets of money, if you know where to look, where you can apply for grants and fellowships and book research stipends. And it exists, and they're out there, and they're there in order to help you do this very kind of thing. And so it was very expensive, and I did spend a bunch of my own money, but I was also the very lucky beneficiary of support from my own university, from certain awards here and there, and from other organizations that are interested in this sort of thing.
Nice. So you talked about this other guy that was working on a documentary, and I did some Googling because, of course, his book is now 4 years old. And I was wondering, did something ever happen with that guy? So I saw that he did have a documentary called Shapiro Vani.
Yes, Shapiro and I, or Shapiro and me.
Right. But I couldn't find, I wanted to watch it yesterday, but I couldn't find it like freely or with English subtitles. So have you seen it?
I have, yeah. I bought the DVD, and what you can find, or at least whenever I last looked several years ago, you can find a trailer for it on YouTube, which is very dramatic, and there's lightning and thunder and rain and all of that. It was interesting for him also. His documentary was a sort of about his personal experience with Shapiro. I think that people who tend to get really involved in this story ultimately come to feel like we knew Shapiro somehow. I spent 6 years with this guy. Whether or not he was alive or dead, I spent 6 years reading everything he wrote, reading everything he read, reading everything anyone else had written about him, going to Germany to meet his relatives, reading books written by his daughter, absolutely trying to learn everything I could about Jerusalem at the time he lived there. So, by the end of this whole experience, I mean, to be honest with you, I'd sort of fallen in love with the guy. I mean, he was, in his way, he was a rogue, but he was also, I'm convinced, an absolute genius to have, so.
Yeah,
again,
tell us about who Shapiro is as a person. What did he do?
Yeah, so, again, he was born, he was a Jew in Poland, and the likelihood is he was educated as a Jew would have been in Poland in that days, in the cheder, or the sort of one-room schoolhouse, traditional Jewish texts, probably lots of Talmud and maybe a little bit of Bible thrown in there. But in any case, he would have early, come upon the skills that would later help him as far as understanding, reading and writing Hebrew and sort of having read much of the Jewish source material. At some point, it appears that his father went to Jerusalem for one reason or another. For many Jews, it's an age-old goal to end up there, or at least to be buried there. So we don't really know why Shapira's father went specifically, but he appears to have gone. Shapira and his grandfather then took off after him for Jerusalem. This is in the late 19th century, the mid 19th century, the 1850s. And along the way, between Kamenets-Podolsk and Jerusalem, Shapira's grandfather died, so he himself never made it to Jerusalem. And Shapira converted to Christianity. And so he arrived alone and penniless, without any particular skills that would help him survive in the world, in Jerusalem. He fell in with a group of local Christians, many of whom were actually Jews who had themselves converted to Christianity. He was educated in woodworking at a school that they ran. That sort of got him into selling carved wood statuettes and books with carved wood covers to tourists coming to Jerusalem, oftentimes sort of breviaries, prayer books, Bibles with these wood covers. That, in a very kind of organic way, led him into selling antiquities. For any of you who's been to Jerusalem, he was on, he was in the old city in what's the Christian quarter on what's now called essentially Christian Street or Christian Quarter Street. It's very close to the entrance to the shuk there. There's a bit of question as to which shop exactly was his, but it's probably one of two, and you can go and see it yourselves. And there he started a very successful business where he became kind of ground zero for antiquities sales in Jerusalem. Anyone who found anything would bring it to him. Bedouin who were out digging in the deserts would bring whatever they found to him. And then he, who sort of fancied himself a scholar of sorts, although he had sort of extraordinary respect for men of greater learning who had actual degrees in this sort of thing and very much wanted their acceptance, he became the place where those folks would go to find all the ancient stuff on which they could then do the kind of work that you all do. Whether it's writing dissertations or articles or transcribing, transliterating, et cetera, et cetera. And so Shapira actually became a very important figure because of that. But not only because of that, because in those days, Germany and France and England, they all saw antiquities, in particular antiquities that you could link to the Bible, as a way to create glory. If they could own these things and display them in their national museums, that would be a way for these nations to seem important, to create glory for themselves. And that meant that Shapira, as the dealer of such things, also became an important guy, a politically connected kind of guy to important folks, ambassadors and spies and scholars, etc., who would come from all of these countries. And so he became this important figure and ended up selling very authentic, very important antiquities, including many, many old Bible scrolls, to the British Museum in London, to the Royal, the Pergamon in Berlin, and elsewhere.
Right. But then it wasn't enough, right? For him, he kind of crossed the line at some point.
Right. So even before Shapira came to the British Museum with this £1 million Deuteronomy manuscript, he'd been the subject of some controversy about a decade earlier in the mid 1870s, when he sold, I believe it was, about 1,700 clay statuettes, figurines that were supposedly of Moabite origin, right? The Moabites, sort of east of the Jordan River, had supposedly created these very crude, sometimes sort of really embarrassing looking statuettes. But at the time, very little was known. The people knew the Moabites existed largely because they were mentioned in the Bible, but Moabite culture was really a mystery at the time. No one had any sense of what Moabite culture really was. And suddenly here's close to 2,000 pieces of Moabite culture, and Shapira had them. And he made a load of money selling them to Berlin. Unfortunately, it turned out that they were all fakes. And so the Germans, as well as Shapiro himself, ended up with a great deal of egg on their face. And so if no one actually blamed Shapiro. He was sort of seen as the unwitting dupe. He had been sold all of these statuettes, and then he sold them on. So he had been fooled just like everybody else. That was the thinking at the time. But when he arrives in England a decade later with the Deuteronomy, people hadn't forgotten about this. So there was some initial skepticism about him showing up with another marvelous find from the sands of the Middle East.
Right. So how did you encountered Shapiro, and then, like you said, you investigated him for 6 years. How did your relationship with Shapiro evolve? How do you see him now?
Yeah, I started touching on that a little earlier. I think I don't want to give away too much of the book, but I'll just say I think that other people who have worked on Shapiro throughout history have largely seen him as essentially a criminal, right? They've focused they've really focused exclusively on the shady dealings for which he became well known. And to a degree, that's fair. To whatever degree he brought that on himself, and he was, as I say, a rogue. But the more I researched him, and the more I dug in, the more I became familiar with the human side of the man. A guy who was married and loved his wife, a guy who had 2 daughters who he adored and they adored him, a guy who, because of his untimely death, never got to meet his grandchildren, never got to find out that his youngest daughter was going to become a world famous novelist working in France, the first recipient of what's called the Prix Femina, which was the first literary award ever created to honor a woman writer. His daughter won that award. She wrote a book about him. This was he was a guy who struggled to keep his business afloat. A guy who was very, on the one hand, I think he had a great deal of hubris. On the other hand, as I say, in the presence of men of greater learning, I think he felt lesser than and deeply wanted to be accepted by these people and was willing to go to almost any length to make that happen. So all of this adds up to a very human story. He's not just this guy who became famous for selling what was at the time considered a fraudulent manuscript to a museum and then dying, although that's true. He's also a man. He's also a guy like any one of us who, loved people.
What really came across from the way how you described him in the book is how desperate he was for respect and love, basically, acceptance. He was always trying to be friends with the upper class, not so much because he wanted that posh lifestyle, because he wanted to be considered one of them and be taken seriously. And one of the biggest the most painful things that people could have said about him at that time was that he was just a poor Jew from Eastern Europe and he should not be taken seriously.
Yes.
That was a big insult to him.
One of the problems for Shapiro was that he was a Jew who converted to Christianity. Jews in Jerusalem at the time, frankly, almost everywhere, hated, apostates. They did not like Jews who left the religion. And so they dismissed him entirely and would not have anything to do with him. In fact, at the time in Jerusalem, apostates were not allowed to be buried in Jewish cemeteries, for example. But the Christians didn't entirely trust him because of this built-in anti-Semitism. So although he had chosen to throw in his lot with Christianity and believed in, the New Testament and et cetera, Christians at the time didn't really trust him either because he was just this little Jew from Kamenets-Podolsk. And so he couldn't fit in anywhere. And that led to a lot of the distrust. Some of it he brought on himself, but a lot of it was, sort of foisted upon him by other people who had preconceived notions about his choices and who he was and what he should have been.
But it also drives a man to do things that otherwise you probably wouldn't have done in life. If you just crave to be accepted, you go out of your way to achieve that, and then you might cross some lines that you otherwise wouldn't.
I think look at the president of the United States right now. I mean, in some ways, I sort of, in the last 4 years, I've seen synergy, shall we say. I just watched, I don't know if you've all seen The Undoing. I think it's on Netflix, or maybe it's an Amazon show. It's Hugh Grant and Nicole Kidman. But Hugh Grant, actually, I don't want to give this away either, but I just watched it last week. But he also plays a guy who's just like desperate to be loved and respected, and does things that a normal person with a normal functioning brain wouldn't do. And I saw Shapira in that. But you described it perfectly. I mean, it leads that kind of craving. It's not even a craving. It's like an absolute, it's like a mental necessity to be accepted. And you will just claw and claw and claw to make that happen. And, he was a guy like that, I think.
Yeah. So it's kind of sad in a way. You just want to give him a hug, say, it's all going to be all right.
I mean, that's it sounds funny to hear you say that, but I did feel that way. I guess one thing I can give, I mean, the book's been out long enough. Ultimately, Shapira ended up taking his own life.
Right.
And it was,
in the Netherlands. I remember reading Dutch articles about it. Yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. In Rotterdam. So, one of the documents that exists, it's at the British Library now. It's in their dossier number 41294, which is a number I'll sort of seared into my brain. And it's ostensibly his suicide note. He basically says, after Ginsberg, the scholar the British Museum had hired to work on his manuscript, after he comes out and says it's a fraud, he writes a note to Ginsberg saying, I don't think I can survive this shame. It's just too much. Right. And, just a short while later, he was dead. I mean, you'd have to be heartless to hold the actual letter in your hand and know what was coming a short while after he actually sat down and wrote this artifact that I'm holding in my hands. To not feel something for the guy at that moment, you've really got to be cold. And as you say, at that moment, you just want to give the guy a hug and say, hey, it's okay. Right.
On the other hand, he did some shady stuff. And so one of the most painful parts for me to read as an archaeologist, and I don't know about you, but how painful it was to read and write about that, was the way that people uncovered biblical artifacts in the 19th century. You give many stories of people blowing up antiquities into little pieces so they can sell them separately, stealing manuscripts from people, communities, holy houses, etc., etc. Of course, as modern archaeologists, we're like, ugh.
I know.
How far did they go?
Yeah, I mean, it was such a different time. Shapira's day and age, biblical archaeology was only just being invented. Archaeology was only just being invented. And so we come at this now with our modern perceptions about, for example, how artifacts ought to be treated, right? So you're an archaeologist in the field, when you're using a toothbrush, right, to get stuff out of the ground. It's painstaking, and it's often boring, and it's hot, and it's difficult. But you're doing it because you understand, because of years and years and years of experience, that it's not just the artifact that's important, it's the context in which the artifact is, that tells you as much as the artifact itself. So you can't disturb the scene of the crime, as it were. No one knew that at the time. Back then, they just saw these shiny things and wanted to grab them out of the earth and sell them and gain glory. And that often led to disaster. I mean, you brought up, Bedouin sort of blowing up the Mesha Stele. That happened. So Shapira himself, when he first brought his supposedly, £1,000,000 manuscript to the British Museum, one of the things that he did was he poured spirits like wine on it and started, rubbing away at it with a brush, because that was the only way you could actually make the text visible. Can you imagine someone there accidentally knocked the whole bottle over onto the manuscript? He tore off a corner of it to pass it around so people could feel it. Now that's unthinkable nowadays, but in the late 1940s, early 1950s, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the truth is they hadn't sort of they hadn't progressed that far beyond Shapira's day, because as many of you probably know, and you've seen the photographs in the Rockefeller Museum in what was then Jordan, you see the scholars working on the Dead Sea Scrolls with cigarettes dangling out of their mouths, and they're using Scotch tape to tape them to the table to do the work on them, right? And that was in the 1950s, not all that long ago. And so you're right. I mean, the way things were dealt with in Shapira's time was probably slightly worse, but not all that much worse. And, you know, when we look at that with the benefit of hindsight, it's horrifying. But it's important to remember that there were no real rules for this sort of thing at that time. It was just developing. Archaeology and biblical archaeology specifically were at the very beginnings of their lives.
Right. It's such a shame that that fascination for biblical archaeology happened at that point and not now, because we could have found so much more, so much. I mean, now the looting happens with you know.
Yeah, well, look, looting is a huge problem everywhere.
Right.
But to a degree, you know, when people are looting, it's because there's a market for the stuff that they loot, which means at least the silver lining here is that there are people who are very interested in this.
Yes. That's always what we say in our community, right? Like, we don't like the Indiana Jones movies, and we don't like all of these pseudo archaeology books being written. But it is a way for people to still be interested in our field and then go out and actually go to a lecture, take a class, read other books, etc. So it's
I think that's exactly right. I mean, that was one of my concerns writing this book, to be honest with you, was that it, to me, sort of the thing in the back of my mind as I wrote at all times was, this is a mystery, right? I had to remind myself, like, this is a mystery, it's a mystery. That's what I was writing. It was a mystery, but it was a mystery that was based, sorry, can you still see me? I just,
I mean, I can on my Zoom meeting, but I don't know what.
Okay, good. You know, but it was a mystery that was based in some serious scholarship. And I was, you know, as I mentioned before, my father is a biblical scholar and has worked in the field for 50, plus years. And I grew up, many of his closest friends are serious biblical scholars. So I grew up with these guys at our table. I was friends with their kids. I know them. And what I really was afraid of, on the one hand, I wanted to write a book that could be read by folks who had never read even the first word of the Bible, never heard the term biblical criticism. I wanted to be, available to a wide audience. But I also wanted my father's biblical scholar friends to be able to read the book and maybe learn something, and at least not say Tigay's kid really screwed it up, right? I was really, really, really freaked out about that and worked very hard to get every single thing I could, correct, even while telling an adventure story. And so, there is this sort of fundamental tension between, real scholarship, and I think there are plenty of scholars who would say the kind of thing I'm doing is, they wouldn't do it themselves. But on the other hand, sometimes there's 6 people reading their books, and
exactly.
it might be important, but if nobody knows about it, it's kind of, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a sound?
Exactly.
So there's tension there.
What SASA is trying to do, right? Getting public humanities, getting our specific knowledge out there, so it's not just us talking to the in crowd all the time. I think your book really succeeded in that. It showed that you don't have to make up aliens or other nonsense to make archaeology fascinating or to make history fascinating. Anybody would watch a Netflix series based on this book, and it would be just as popular as Ancient Aliens would be. So my question is, when is the Netflix series coming?
Well, I don't know, but if anyone knows a producer over there, let me know. I will say, I think one of the, in advance of this, I was sort of thinking about, like, how specifically is what I do different, from what you do, beyond the, beyond you're actually, I presume, out there digging and, sometimes, and I don't do that, but, and I think part of what people who do what I do that's different from sort of real scholars of ancient studies, ultimately what I'm writing about is people, right? So I'm writing about Shapira and everything, all that other stuff, the biblical scholarship and the archaeology, the birth of archaeology and biblical criticism, that's the kind of water in which Shapira is swimming. Right. But at the heart of the story is the man, the person. I always tell my writing students this, like, always remember that what people are going to be interested in what you're writing, everything, interesting facts, phenomena, wonderful. They're going to be interested in the people. And I think that, the thing that scholars tend to do, and I'm not saying this is not a criticism, I'm just sort of thinking about what the differences are. I think you all sort of focus on phenomena or a period or a discovery or an artifact and sort of try to move the ball a little bit further down the field. And that's just, a little bit of a difference.
But I think it is real scholarship, what you're doing, right? You're a real historian going into archives, puzzling it back together, and then writing about what happens. And then also sometimes your own interpretations, but it is real scholarship.
Well, I appreciate your saying that. And to a degree, I do the same sorts of things you do. And then where we sort of diverge is when we just actually sit down in front of the computer to start typing, I think. Yes. But I'm as I said a few times, my dad's a biblical scholar, so I understand what real biblical scholarship is. My book is not real biblical scholarship, it's not supposed to be, but it's an adventure story that sort of revolves around biblical scholars.
Yeah. I mean, I think we need to have more of these kind of books out there. And when I was reading it, I was actually Googling the buildings that you mentioned and the people that you mentioned, and I wanted to see more visuals of all of that. So that's why I thought maybe a Netflix series or maybe a museum exhibition. Would it be an idea to have all the different things about Shapira in one place with pictures and movies?
Well, I'll tell you, I think if I had it all to do over again, I would include photographs in the book. Mm-hmm. I didn't do it at the time for a variety of reasons, which I won't get into because they're boring and technical, but I wish I had done that. Mm-hmm. That being said, there have been exhibits, for example, in the Israel Museum, in the home that Shapira lived in Jerusalem, in the Russian compound, put on an exhibition of many of the sort of the hoax statuettes, Moabite, the Moabitica, as it was known. So they had a big exhibit of that. And one of the things that actually really surprised me as I went around the world, trying to gather information, is that some of the most serious museums and collections in the world still have Shapira's known fake Moabite artifacts. They haven't gotten rid of them. They haven't thrown them. Right? Typically, you find out something's fake and it's, gotten rid of it. It's like embarrassing. But the British Museum, the Pergamon, the Archaeology Museum at Hebrew University, the guy who used to run, the Rockefeller Museum, in the entryway to his home in downtown Jerusalem has two fake Shapira heads that he uses as bookends. The Palestine Exploration Fund, in a glass case, has a display of like 20 different of these Moabitica statues. So I think because of the like wonderful backstory to these pieces, they're still considered important in a way, because they do point to something interesting about the birth of archaeology and biblical archaeology. Also, they're just like fun and interesting. They really kind of get people excited. So I was really surprised that people saved these things and even display them still in some cases.
Yeah, Shapira is everywhere in the world. Little pieces of him he would have loved that he has.
I always think that he would be so pleased to know that these things were still being displayed and his name was still being uttered all these years later.
Yeah. So has this whole journey changed you personally? Because I know that you're, as you said, you grew up in a Jewish environment, so you're religious yourself. You talk about going to synagogue and stuff. Has this journey changed anything about your belief system or your personal opinions?
It hasn't changed my belief system. I think I'll tell you what surprised me as I went along is that, I sort of, as you mentioned, I came up as a journalist and investigative journalist. For me, like, facts are king. in order to write something down on the page, I need to be able to demonstrably show that it is in fact true. And yet, the more I dug, the more I became convinced that, like, oh my God, I think Shapira's manuscript was authentic. Like, I think it was real. And that really surprised me. I was like, wow, who's this guy, that I'm becoming? And, for a time, the same thing happened to my father, who, if I think I'm fact-based and fact-obsessed, my dad is like 100 times that. He's a scholar. He won't write the word "the" unless he can, like footnote it, And yet along the way, I think he too sort of became convinced that, maybe it wasn't written by Moses himself, okay, but maybe this was in fact some kind of ancient document. You might be familiar with the Samaritan Pentateuch, something along those lines, a different kind of Bible that we're less familiar
with. Right,
which is exactly.
The Peshitta and like the Coptic versions and all of that, yeah.
That's exactly right. So that surprised me even more, that at some point, my father, who I'd never heard, once in his life come anywhere near believing in any kind of weird theory, that he too started thinking like, oh, this is really interesting. So again, I don't want to give away the end, but that to me was a very surprising development.
I taught for SASA a summer course on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I will probably do that again next summer, where we take a scroll every week and read the translation of it, and then we talk about it in group. And so you say that this scroll was connected to the Dead Sea Scrolls at some point. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Shapira scroll.
Yes. Sorry.
I mean, that was one of the things that sort of hooked me at the very beginning, was that Shapira's Deuteronomy seemed, he came, this was in 1883 that he came to England with this manuscript. And Dead Sea Scrolls weren't discovered until 1947, right? So we're talking about, 6 decades in between. And no one had ever discovered anything like the Dead Sea Scrolls before that. And so Shapira's discovery was like utterly weird and utterly strange and completely new. And what kind of hooked me initially was the thought, like, these scrolls, if they're authentic, they might be the first Dead Sea Scroll discovered 60 or 70 years before the rest. And even if they're fake, they predict the Dead Sea Scrolls 60 years before they were discovered, which means that whoever created them was some, total like whiz kid, a genius, who was really creative, really knew their stuff biblically, and was able to kind of make certain weird changes to them that on the one hand were sort of titillating to believers and scholars, and on the other hand seemed like maybe they could have been authentic. And so that's the Dead Sea Scroll connection to me, that it either was the first Dead Sea Scroll, right, which is pretty darn cool if you think about it, or
because Shapira said that the Bedouin told him they found this scroll in a cave close to the Dead Sea. So of course you think, well, he found one of the first Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not.
That was the thing when, when in the late 1940s and early 50s, when sort of the Dead Sea Scrolls became really well known in the world, some scholars who had, if not themselves been alive in 1883, had sort of come of age, not too long after that. And this idea that these, biblical manuscripts written on leather, discovered by wandering Bedouin in caves near the Dead Sea, full of variant readings from the traditional text. They heard this story in 1947, 48, the 50s, and they thought, that sounds exactly like this guy Shapira, who everyone had sort of forgotten about in the intervening years. And so that's why people initially started going back and trying to see if they could prove whether or not Shapira's manuscript was in fact the first Dead Sea Scroll. They heard about the...
In the 50s, people were picking the story back up and doing research on it again.
Yeah, exactly. They felt like, whoa, if this is the first Dead Sea Scroll, we need to see exactly what was in it. But the problem was, that's when they discovered that Shapira's scroll had mysteriously vanished. Right. None of them could actually find it. And that, of course, if you're a writer, is very, very attractive material. Suddenly you've got a mystery on your hands.
Yeah. So the book has been out for 4 years now. What is the influence it has had, or any, and the reaction of the people, the scholarly
Yeah.
community and the non-scholarly community?
I mean, non-scholarly community, I can only sort of read the reviews in newspapers and on Amazon occasionally. But in the scholarly community, I honestly, the most, when I first wrote the book, I thought like the most gratifying thing is going to be if I get a great review from the Wall Street Journal or the Christian Science Monitor or whatever. And of course, that, when that stuff happens, it is great. It's really exciting. But the most meaningful, aside from my parents' reaction, because they were involved along the way, and this is so much my father's life, but aside from their reaction, Emmanuel Tove, who was the executive editor of the Dead Sea Scroll project in Israel for decades. So he is really the great, if not, one of the great Dead Sea Scroll scholars who's ever lived. And he wrote a review of it in a Hebrew publication for biblical scholars, the name of which now escapes me. But he wrote a really, really wonderful review of the book on this site. And all that reception for me was like the most gratifying thing, because I really felt like I was pretty confident that I was able to tell an interesting story. But to hear from one of the great Dead Sea Scroll scholars that I sort of got it right and was able to make it interesting was extraordinarily meaningful. So that was really great. I haven't heard anything from Yoram Sabo, who is the documentary filmmaker, for a variety of reasons, I'm sure. But Matthew Hamilton, who, he's an amateur scholar, but a brilliant guy. And he was, I'll just say, instrumental in my own hunt. And he's pretty sure I got it wrong in the end.
Oh, really? So he's the guy in
So-
Australia that you went to visit, right? Who
Yeah.
thinks he knew what happened to the scroll after Shapiro died? Because that was always the big question. We kind of know what happened in the first year to the scroll. It was on an exhibition, but then after that, it just drops off the face of the earth, and nobody knows what happened to it. And he claimed that he knows who bought the scroll, and he told the mystery of where it is now. But he doesn't.
Exactly. That was his major contribution. Although he's done an incredibly impressive amount of research into this, in minute detail. And so I think he disagrees with me on my conclusions, but I think that's fairly typical in this kind of work. There's always there are always people who disagree. So I can't argue too hard with him, because he's a brilliant guy, and he's not at some point it becomes subjective, and we're not going to resolve it, but he was ultimately a very, very helpful.
But that's also a good the strength of a good mystery, right? Even if we have the solution, it might still not be the actual answer. There still might be more digging that needs to be done, and the problem will never be solved.
Yes, that's right. I mean, to a degree, I think that's correct. Yeah. Especially when it comes to something like the Bible, I think, where people come at this stuff with really preconceived notions, and not preconceived notions that they got as undergraduate history majors or getting PhDs in ancient history. The preconceived notions that they have been nursing since literally, the day they were born. So that, add that into the mix, and oftentimes you don't come to really, really solid conclusions.
Right. So in this last couple of minutes, do you want to say something about the project that you're currently working on and what we can expect in the future from you?
Well, it's interesting. The project that you mentioned isn't in fact what I'm currently working on, because it's changed. It's changed since wherever you read that, because it required a lot of travel, and COVID has made that impossible for the time being. So while I was sort of quarantining at home, maybe some of the story about the Museum of the Bible.
Oh God, yes. Right. I have also been giving lectures for SASA on the Museum of the Bible, and it's very problematic.
Then we should talk after this for sure. So for anyone who doesn't know, the Museum of the Bible in It's like 3 blocks from the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. And it's this glitzy, beautiful new facility about the history of the Bible. And it's run by the Green family, who are the billionaire founders of Hobby Lobby, this craft store chain. And they're also evangelicals and have been sort of lovers of the Bible for, I presume, many, many decades. The centerpiece of the museum was depending how you count them, 16 fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which, to make a long story short, turn out to have been forged. Now, as that became the big story in the news, what is less reported is that there are a large number of other organizations that also bought fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, all sort of starting after 2002, all related in one way or another. Turns out to have been this sort of international conspiracy to forge Dead Sea Scrolls. And so then my next book is actually about this Dead Sea Scroll forgery. So in many ways, it's like a sequel to the first one. And, I had sort of vowed not to do this again. But as I said before, obsession is the kind of thing you don't control exactly. And turns out this is what I'm interested in. So.
And we need you, Chanan. The world needs books like this.
I appreciate you saying that. Thank you. You could tell my mother-in-law. That'd be great. No, I'm kidding.
Well, thank you so much for being here. We are out of time, but this has been very pleasant.
It's great. I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you for the wonderful questions. And do keep in touch about the Museum of the Bible. I'm interested to hear what you've learned. And also, please let David Danzig know, who couldn't be here today, that I appreciate very much his invitation.
Will do. Thank you.
Right.
And this is the end of our hour. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We have many more live events and other activities planned for December and then 2021. So please subscribe to our newsletter if you want to be kept up to date on all of that, and follow us on social media. And we will see each other soon. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone. Take care.